Hey guys, I'm really sorry that I'm not there today. I don't feel very good and I kind of barely made it through yesterday, so taking the day to kind of catch up and rest. I should still be able to answer emails, so I'm a little bit behind, but I'll try my best to make sure that I get back to you as soon as possible. There's a couple things that we're gonna go over today. It's gonna be kind of like a normal class, like I'm just gonna go through things as if I was there. But the first thing that I want to cover is the note cards. So I did push the deadline back slightly, and I want to talk to you guys about it. Number one, I know that a lot of you are just kind of holding on until spring break. And while you may not want to work over spring break, a lot of you probably will, just in terms of catching up. I do want to stress that I won't be specifically assigning homework for spring break. There will be homework that goes through spring break, but it won't be due like the day you get back. So it would be time that if you needed to catch up on things for this class, you could, but you wouldn't have to work on it if you were caught up. So that's just something to keep in mind. The idea with the note cards is that we need to move on next week to the next part, so the part after note cards, which would be the outline. So I'm going to show you next week's class. Basically, Monday I'm going to do class as per usual, and then on the Tuesday, Wednesday class block, I'm going to take the note cards and basically teach you how to go into the outline. I would argue that the outline is probably the hardest step of all of them to do. It is the most intellectually challenging and aggravating, and so you need to have a base of note cards ready to go, or it will be confusing. So you do need to have at least a base of them. I know for some of you guys, you're desperately trying to catch up and like stay on top of work. So this is what I will say. Well, I would heavily prefer that you are done with the note cards by the time you come to class next Wednesday for you guys. You must have 10 of them done from at least 2 sources. You must. Like, it's a non-negotiable that has to happen. If for some reason you are running very far behind, I don't want to find out after the fact. I need you to email me ahead of time. This isn't permission to just turn it in late. So if you are one of those people who is really, really behind and you can't finish the note cards in time, you need to be reaching out and contacting me, please. But I will still push that 10 is non-negotiable from multiple sources. That would allow you to kind of understand what I'm talking about next week when we go on to the outline. And then just to kind of demonstrate where we would stand with that, the following week is spring break, so it would be kind of a catch-up week for you guys. And then you'll notice when we come back, so it still says note cards, my apologies. The outline is actually due the following Monday. So we're not necessarily looking at something that is particularly taxing. It's not an assignment that's due like the day we get back, so just kind of keep that in mind. Hopefully that helps a little bit. It makes the AMSCO and the note cards not due on the same day, but you need to stay on top of stuff because we're coming into spring break and you need to stay on top of stuff, please. All right, let's talk about the topic for today. There aren't a lot of slides for this, so when we're looking at this particular piece, I know there's not a lot of slides. I will say you need to take notes because I'm going to talk about a lot more than what's on here, and if you don't really understand what I'm talking about, it's going to be really bad because this is the foundation for the Cold War. So when we're looking at basically the rest of the class for this year, it is all going to come back to the origins of the Cold War and how did that start, and that's this lecture. So you do need to have notes out, pause the video, open them, whatever you want to do, and I'm flat out telling you, you need more than what is written on the slides. Like, that's not enough. Miss Pontius, are you collecting these? No, but I'm testing you on it, so take notes. One of the major things that happens during World War II is basically the breakdown of how we really start the Cold War. While there's a lot of debate about when exactly the Cold War starts, is it right away in 1945? Is it a couple years later in 1947? Is it as late as 1949? While there is some debate about exactly when the Cold War starts, what I want you to realize is that it's not just this switch and this event that happens that we can mark. It is kind of this increasing tension that builds up from World War II into the Cold War. And a lot of that comes down to what the US and the USSR want and how those two things are very different. So when we look at the breakdown of the US and USSR alliance, one of the things that we see from the very beginning with the United States, from the Atlantic Charter forward, is this idea of self-determination. That nations should be able to essentially govern themselves, and this really marks the end of imperialism. That we want, especially Britain and France, to let go of their imperial powers, for Germany to let go of their imperial holdings, and allow those nations to self-determine. And we also wanted, and this goes all the way back to Wilson in World War I, free global trade. So this is capitalism, but we supported it in the wake of World War II with things like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and things like that. And we'll see it play out in other areas as well. But the United States is very interested in promoting self-determination and essentially globalized capitalism. The USSR, for their part, is very interested in security, like actual security from invasion. You have to consider that in 2 world wars, they were invaded by Germany pretty successfully. While yes, in both cases they ultimately held off their invader, it was at very, very high cost. And so what the USSR wants more than anything is this buffer between Germany and the Soviet Union as basically a form of security from getting attacked again. And it leads to the occupation, essentially, of the Eastern Bloc of Europe. Countries like Romania and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland all kind of fall under the purview of the Red Army, and the USSR basically just refuses to pull them back out. But because the United States is so interested in other things, they kind of let it happen. This was never an alliance that was completely happy. And that's something that I want you to consider. Like, when we look at the origins of World War II, especially in Europe, before the United States even enters, one of the main factors in terms of why Britain is alone and comes to the United States is because the Soviets and the Nazis in Germany have signed a pact to basically split Poland. And so because of that non-aggression pact, Britain was essentially left alone. And so until Germany went back on their word and attacked the Soviet Union, there were no other allies in Europe. And then all of a sudden, Britain is faced with an ally that she never expected, who attacked a country that brought her into the war in the first place, Poland, and now they're allies. Uneasy allies. Winston Churchill even goes onto the radio and says publicly to the British people that while the USSR are their allies, they don't necessarily trust them or support communism. And so this essentially alliance of convenience is forged, and as it breaks down as the war goes away and this common enemy goes away, that's when a lot of the problems start to come out. And this is really evident in especially the last major 3 conferences. So Tehran, Potsdam, and Yalta. But those different goals really leads to that dissolution of the alliance and the origins of the animosity that become the Cold War. To that end, as the Soviet Union really starts to hold on to the Eastern Bloc and pushes for this expansion in the name of security, the United States ambassadors start to get really worried, and one of the main ambassadors to the USSR is a man named George F. Kennan. And as he's watching the Soviet Union essentially occupy Eastern Europe and push for the expansion even into Asian countries, he writes something called the Long Telegram. It's about 8,000 words long, so yeah, it's a long telegram. And in it, he basically states that the Soviet Union is very expansionary, aka imperialist, and the United States is supposedly anti-imperialist at this time. And what he claims is that long-term, patient but firm, vigilant containment of Russia's expansive tendencies was needed. That in order to contain their expansion, you had to have this constant vigilance, basically always pushing on them to like stay inside their borders, otherwise they were going to continue to try and expand. And that word, contain, becomes really important. It becomes the basis of the ideology that the United States uses for its foreign policy. Containment is the blanket umbrella term. It is the idea that policies are built upon. It is the ideology. So the whole idea that you kind of want to consider with containment, if we were in class, I could do this better, but when you contain something, you're not necessarily getting rid of it. You're just preventing it from spreading. So imagine like water being poured on a table with no container, it would go everywhere. If you put a piece of Tupperware on the table and then you poured water into that, it would be contained. And so it's the idea that you have this firm, vigilant containment, that you keep it in its little Tupperware and you don't let it spread to other parts of the world. That's what the United States wants. So when you look at something like Eastern Europe, where the Red Army already is, you don't see containment because communism is already there. You're not eradicating it, you're just preventing it from spreading further. And so when we're looking at other countries, especially Western Europe, we're really trying to prevent communism from expanding as opposed to trying to shrink it. We're going to see this played out in two major policies. The first one is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is super altruistic. It's probably one of my favorite pieces of US foreign policy. Is it a little selfish? Yes, but most foreign policy is. This one is really smart though. And it's very successful. At the end of World War II, Western Europe is devastated. It's just annihilated. Not only is the Western Front completely in shambles, especially in France, but you went through two really difficult winters in a row where it was very difficult to grow crops. People are living in certain areas in Europe on less than 700 calories a day, some of it worm infested. People are basically barely above starving. The economy is in shambles. Money isn't worth anything. The governments are strapped for cash. They don't seem to be able to fix anything. And the concern is that if the government cannot stabilize the economy and they cannot stabilize the culture that they are supposedly in charge of, people will vote them out. And people can vote out in very extreme ways, which is what happened in the 1930s when people voted in fascism. Well, at this point, fascism is pretty contained, but communism is still fairly prevalent, especially with the support of the USSR. And the concern is that communist parties in Western Europe are going to appeal to these poor, starving people who the government cannot take care of and say, we have a solution, vote us in, and they will. And so the United States plan is to provide economic aid to the governments in order to help them reestablish their economies, which would then boost support for those governments. Unhappy people revolt. Happy people are usually more than likely going to vote in the same government. Even if you're not super happy all the time, even if you just make it to content, they'll probably keep you in office. And so with this huge amount of funding, one of the things that we did is we prioritized this notion that we weren't going to get this money back directly. These aren't loans, they're grants. Grants are free money, you don't have to pay them back, so it's money that's given to you, but grants often come with strings attached, so certain requirements that you have to fulfill in order to get that quote-unquote free money. This is different than the end of World War I, because the end of World War I, we issued loans. We expected that money to come back, and it led to economic disaster in the 1930s. Grants were designed to basically boost the economy of our largest trading partners in Western Europe, with the idea being that if their economies recovered, trade on an international level would resume, and we would basically make that money back in tax revenue over time, which we kind of did. But in order to receive that aid, you had to comply with US wishes. And one of the main things that they wanted was for each country to come up with a plan and really focus that money on a couple select industries. So perhaps in Britain, they're revitalizing their coal and steel industry, while in France, they're focused more on textiles and clothing. Well, both countries need coal and steel, and both countries need textile and clothing. If they're both focusing on different industries, they would also have to have low trade barriers, or no trade barriers, basically, and then they would trade with each other. And this would promote that global capitalism that America was really interested in starting. So any country that received Marshall Plan aid, they got to decide what industries they were going to revitalize. Like, that was their choice. But they also then had to have low trade barriers with all other recipient countries so that they could all trade together. And that's how the United States essentially recouped a lot of the cost, was by revitalizing all of these economies, and then they all traded with each other. It became a way to basically say, see, your government is good. It can do this. They needed a little bit of help. Don't vote them out, though. They can do this. And so that stability within the economy led to stability within the politics, which prevented the expansion of communism. Because people were once again satisfied that their government could respond to the situation, and so they didn't need to be voted out. The other thing that the US does in terms of containment is something called the Truman Doctrine. We're going to see several doctrines throughout US history, so we've already discussed the Monroe Doctrine, and then we looked at the Roosevelt Corollary, Dollar Diplomacy, and Moral Diplomacy, which were amendments to the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to see the Truman Doctrine right now, the Eisenhower Doctrine, and the Nixon Doctrine. They're all specific forms of foreign policy, and they're all directed at certain areas of the world. So with the Monroe Doctrine, just keep in mind that that is mostly focused at, like, Latin America. More than Latin America, but, like, that's where it tends to get applied to. It's like the Americas in general. The Truman Doctrine is specifically going to apply to Greece and Turkey. So in both of these countries, they had been receiving aid from Britain in order to kind of prop up their nationalistic governments. Those governments were very pro-Western, but they were being challenged by communist governments and rebels within both countries. The problem is that Britain couldn't afford to maintain aid anymore. They could barely afford to keep their own people happy. They were part of the recipients of the Marshall Aid. And so they told the United States, we can't provide funding anymore. You either need to help and step in and provide funding, or it's very likely that these countries are going to fall to these communist rebels. And so the United States took the place as the aid giver that Britain had previously held, signaling that the United States is stepping into the superpower role that Britain had previously occupied. They issued money, they issued military equipment in an effort to help these countries contain the spread of communism and fight back against basically communist rebels inside their country. And they ultimately were successful in doing that. These are really important countries. Greece is really important mostly for ideology because it's considered to be the birthplace of Western democracy. And Turkey is very important geographically. It controls a couple of different passageways into the Mediterranean, and it kind of creates this gateway into Europe and the Middle East. And so controlling, or at least having influence in Turkey, was really geographically important, especially in the age of oil. One of the last major things that the United States does during this time period is they establish something called NATO, which you've probably heard of. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is new. This has never happened before in US history. It is a peacetime military alliance. Up until this point in US history, we had very fervently eschewed joining any military alliances during peacetime. It's one of the reasons that we don't get sucked into World War I very early. It's one of the reasons that we don't get sucked into World War II very early. We had avoided having military alliances with especially Europe, even though we traded with them considerably. The whole idea with NATO is that it is a defensive alliance. And so it takes a couple of key policies that really debuted during Bismarck's time, this idea of balance of powers, that you have this huge counterweight of all of these nations who have agreed to come to each other's aid to balance power against a perceived threat, in this case the Soviet Army, which is still occupying all of Eastern Europe. However, unlike Bismarck and unlike what happened in World War I, this is public. They have a website today. Like, you can go on there and see exactly who is part of this treaty. It's not a secret. You know exactly who is on whose side when it comes to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But one of the key features of NATO is something called Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause. And what it says is that an attack against one is perceived as an attack against all. So if, for example, you were to attack France, all of the NATO countries would attack you back. This does not apply if you attack first. So, for example, if France were to go out and attack another country first, and then that country attacks France back, NATO does not have your back on that one, because you initiated that. We've actually only seen the Collective Security Clause invoked once, and that was for 9/11 for the United States, where all of the nations of NATO responded in kind and attacked the people who attacked us back. It is designed to be a deterrent. So like I said, it doesn't get invoked if you are the aggressor. It will only apply if you are the nation that is attacked. So it does imply that you have to be attacked first. But that is kind of what makes it UN compliant, is that it doesn't have an offensive mechanism and everything is very public. Like, you can see exactly what they have agreed to and who is involved in it, and it is designed to deter you from attacking those countries because all of them will come for you. On Friday, we will be going over these documents. So we're not going to do it the way that it's on here. This is why it says do not do this. I have a series of different documents that we're going to be looking at for early Cold War. And some of them include things like the NATO document and the early conferences. But we're going to do that in a group, which should make it a lot more manageable. Hopefully this served you well. I know it's only like 23, 24 minutes long, but I would imagine you're going to have to kind of slow it down and pause to take notes. So please make sure that you have them, because I did talk about a lot of stuff that wasn't specifically on the slides that you really should know, so that when you go into a testing, you know them. Also, please keep in mind, because this is US history, I will be mostly focusing on the US perspective during the Cold War. However, if you are in IB, we will be going through this almost the entire second semester next year. You need to know this. Thank you guys so much for your time. I'm sorry I'm not there, but I will see you guys on Friday. Thank you. Bye.